Were the antebellum plantation holders driven purely by economic factors, or did they actually hold an ideology? Aside from the strictly greedy, what was the philosophy of the influential, those in power, and the elites who were building a society within a society? What exactly did they read and believe in to create a worldview where they actually viewed themselves as benevolent caretakers, defending a pre modern civilization? They were a Celtic Baptist culture that largely came from the border regions and highlands of the United Kingdom. The rich created plantations along the coast, while the poor established farms in the countryside. In the UK outlands, they had a reputation and honor-based culture. They contrasted themselves from northern industrial societies that they labeled as crude and money-grubbing. Genovese, an antebellum historian, argued that they had an ideology of mastery of nature, where they utilized natural hierarchy. They thought themselves as paternalist, responsible for those under them, creating a harmonic social system based off of social duties, developed codes of honor, an aristocratic class modeled after ancient Greece and Rome, which were used as examples and proof of a higher civilization based off of hierarchy. Paternalism was a civic duty of responsibility, protection, and to civilize. They were largely market dependent for certain goods or raw materials. Many times, most ended up being market dependent, largely due to debt. Much of that debt came from buying slave labor, though bigger plantations were heavily self-sufficient. James Henry Hammond argued it created social stability and prevented class division. George Fitzhugh said it was a stable form of socialism. Him and others also thought government should control markets when needed to control stability. This could include the enforcement of slavery itself, validated by society over the individual. Him and others paralleled Marxism in their aversion to a competitive, money-driven market society, and they agreed on the same principal cause issues. Lewis Hart's book, The Liberal Tradition in America, points out that Southern paternalism and European socialism grew out of the same anti-liberal individualism. Slavery turned out to be largely heavily debt-driven. Plantation holders were over-leveraged against slave prices, land, and crop yield. They criticized money worship and factory owners as exploiting people. They saw themselves as benevolent social engineers over wealth and standard of living, that their form of society uplifted the human condition, which was centralized to distribute wealth and needs where it was needed, as opposed to the capitalists, wage slavery and industrial greed, where workers lacked social support, and individuals would either sink or swim. They believed their system created harmony between the classes, as opposed to the social mobility chaos. Plantation holders traded reciprocal obligations as a social order of moral guardianship, as opposed to industrial markets and chaos, based on materialism and industrial exploitation as how they viewed the North. They believed capitalism would be the end of a stable working class and pre-modern social order. Was their goal wealth or ideologically driven? There are actually many writers that show they actually believed that they were creating a socially harmonious civilization built on hierarchical needs, class division of labor, allowing for a managerial class that had time to learn, educate, and elevate their condition, preserving white dominance and against mass democracy. They claim to hate greed and capitalism, all while depending on markets, credits, and subservient labor. A pre-bourgeoisie ideology that uses capitalist markets. Would those markets have continued as a focal point, if not leveraged by debt and cost? Were they ideologically sincere or just self-justified? In some accounts, planners not crushed by debt allowed for midday breaks, shorter workdays, and even pay. Other accounts showed continued labor towards expanding plantations, status, expansion, or competitive commodity participation. As the cotton gin expanded across competitive markets, by the late 1830s, the lower prices increased the need for cotton output, which tightened supervision, labor systems, and quotas. Genovese argued large slaveholders saw themselves as patriarchs, not exploiters, and that their writings emphasized stability, harmony, and moral authority. Care was operated within a narrow framework, but believed that the slaves would come to appreciate what was shared with them and their elevated condition in contrast to poor free labor, capitalism, or famine back in Africa. The 36 Writers Project, which are interviews of former slaves, reflects some did have this viewpoint where conditions were less harsh. That will be a video of its own. Ultimately, planners were preserving class, dominance, expanding wealth, strategies that preserved hierarchy, and the guardians to protecting an ancient social order. The planners read literature from Aristotle, Cicero, Plato, and Roman law, along with writers more contemporary to their days like Thomas Dew, James Hammond, William Harper, Thomas Carlyle, Henry Hughes, George Fitzhugh, among others, who all believed in a social duty, were strongly anti-individualist and anti-free market capitalism, and many pledged the need for self-sufficiency over profit. Karl Marx argued class struggle cannot be suppressed by hierarchy, like in slavery, but resolved by collective ownership, despite being morally and politically divergent. Slaveholding paternalism, French Revolution Jacobins, and Marxism share a departure from Lockean individualistic philosophy. They had a shared focus on the collectivization of labor, class structure, as central to class stability, anti-capitalist, and social duty as the organizing principles of society. But each had a different solution. Everyone had a social duty to play their part within their social role, to produce surplus for order and survival. The planners believed they had eliminated class struggle by creating a laboring class and a paternalistic intellectual class in charge of running it and responsible for welfare and protection. Slavery seems irrespective to the needs of laborers. The planters used free laborers as an example of how their system provided for various needs and created security for the slaves, calling free laborers poor white trash, that they didn't have job security, access to medicine, housing stability, and didn't eat meat on a regular basis. 2 meals a day could cost a day's wage, as compared to their slaves who ate meat on a regular basis and didn't have to bother for their needs. The word capital was used for hundreds of years to mean wealth. Capitalism was a derogatory word coined by French socialist critics in the 1840s and popularized by Marx. To Marx, capitalism was owning production, which forced extraction from the laborer, a very broad definition, which basically means anything market-based, outside of the abolition of private property. For Marx, class was political and elite by private domination, where the labor class would administrate but not own production. From antiquity until today, a powerful anti-Lockean current in Western thought conceived society not as a collection of self-owning individuals bound by contract, but as an organic whole, structured around labor, hierarchy, and collective obligation, rooted in civil order, medieval corporatism, and feudalistic structure. This tradition emphasizes a social duty over individual autonomy and treated economic organization as the foundation of political authority. Southern slave-holding theorists drew on inheritance to defend a paternal closed plantation order that argued that a fixed laboring class under the responsibility of the elites prevented the instability of wage competition and class conflict. Southern writers like James Henry Hammond, in his Mudsill speech, said society needs a labor class, which creates stability. Free wage creates class conflict. Both Marx and Southerners studied serfdom, recognizing it was structured around land and non-market oriented. The Southerners saw it as organic. Marx saw it as something to reform against private ownership, which created hierarchy. He saw that labor had different value and understood the value in different pay scales, even though that created inequality. To Marx's class was not in the difference of income. It was who owned the factory or the industry. He thought private ownership created political powers that represented a owner class over the laborer who is exploited under the system, be it slavery or capitalism, which was maintained by political power. He believed in political classes being empowered by the laborers. If all labor was collectivized, there would be no owner class. He believed that eventually the state would wither away as the system was learned and established. Distribution would no longer be wage-based, products would be abundant and given freely to need. So, class was ownership. If all own nothing, eliminating a class to subjugate the other by ownership to one's needs, making man a slave for labor, for need, to the owners who control and therefore dominate, which asks the question, can collective ownership prevent power to reform? Marx's philosophy was based off of stages. He was not an economist, but his systemic vision encompassed economics, fully eliminating the capitalist who creates the endeavor with his money and further earning money by exploiting workers with low pay, keeping a large share of profit for themselves. He saw that capitalism drove down cost as businesses became competitors, which would only further to drive down wages, he thought. Capitalism led to diminishing markets that would drive down prices until businesses went out of business, and the rest are conglomerated together into monopolies, further constricting wages. If workers were consumers, then those low wages would create less demand, so he thought the crisis of overproduction could be solved by taking money out of the equation. If wages paid for things, then why not bypass the instability of wages and prices and create a system that simply produced to fulfill needs without a monetary system? He thought capitalism needed new consumers, which meant geographic expansion, colonies, and global integration. If it didn't expand, it would saturate markets. Recession would happen and collapse would occur. In the final stages, there would be no money, no pay, and no choice, out which is effectively slavery. He was not very detailed on how communism would function, besides assuming people are highly cooperative and motivated for material needs. His saying from each, according to ability, to each, according to needs, was similar to what the plantation holders believed they were doing. Slaves were worked in positions of their ability and given to their needs. Communist states hold assets on behalf of the collective. The slave master's private ownership gave him the power to distribute to the needs of the plantation. The plantation owners thought capitalism immoral, exploitive, and unstable for workers and society as a whole. They spun slavery with a moral slant that they were creating a system they thought was benevolent and an improvement of condition for both white and black that created security. They saw the plantation as being shared and the provider for all, and in that way they were paternalist in operating the plantation on all of their behalfs. There were laws for the so-called protection of slaves for their safety, which made it illegal to kill a slave or abuse them, and whites were prosecuted where evidence and complaints were available, although few. Laws were also passed, like making it illegal to free a slave over a certain age, which would leave him destitute, enforcing a sort of pension by the master, if it was actually on the slave's behalf, or to limit freeing too many who would be past working age and destitute. It falls in line with the outcome of social order and duty at the individual's expense, not ignoring the irony of keeping one enslaved for their own good. It's not inconceivable that they believed in their social order. Egalitarian Marxist states are responsible for millions of lives for the sake of a social order above the individual. After the Civil War, masters were shocked that the slaves would even want to leave after Reconstruction. In time, 60 to 80% returned to the plantation and worked for pay, sometimes where the master was able to keep his land. Other times, the destitute master was even taken in by slaves who had acquired his plantation, as in the case with Robert Smalls. In other cases, given money and help from former slaves, showing amazing empathy. As the abolitionists' points became stronger, the Southern planters had to turn from morally beneficial to strictly racial justifications as even more for a need for their paternalism, a divergence from culturalism and status-based domination that started in the 1600s when whites were slaves in the Americas, and even blacks had land and slaves. This can be seen in the story of Anthony Johnson, one of the first 23 blacks, brought in 1619 on the White Lion after being taken from a Portuguese slave ship bound for Brazil and sold as indentured servants to pay for their passage and food to Virginia. In time, they all gained their freedom, and most had plantations and slaves of their own. Anthony Johnson wouldn't release one of his black slaves due to the money he thought he owed him due to sabotage. His white neighbors paid for his slaves' defense to be freed, but the judge agreed with Johnson, and for the first time awarding the first lifetime slave in America to a black man around 1643, nor did being black stop them from being a slave trader of white Irish indentured servants to the Americas like Johnson. In another case, gaining 50 acres per person as per head count rights, and acquired over 3,000 acres in slaves as one black man did. In time, whites were excluded from slavery as the numbers of blacks increased, driving down prices and becoming a class with racial correlation. Marx saw money as power, but money is simply stored labor, and prices measure scarcity. Profit is made by the efficiency taken to produce it, and the value of it to people for needs or wants. Labor is your value of time to needs and wants. If scarcity to want or need is measured with price, then with the very first sale, that value is measured and reflected in price. Part of efficiency is not shorting your workers, but paying them well to keep them. Their experience is high production and less time and training due to turnover or mistakes. Free market capitalism is not simply the use of money. In definition, it's private ownership of production, made by individuals voluntarily selling their labor, and where goods are exchanged in freely traded markets, where prices are determined by supply and demand with minimal government intervention. Slavery has no free exchange among individuals, nor free bargaining for labor and equal competition. In capitalism, prices are consensual between all parties. A good must be a benefit over somebody's time and labor, giving them a value. Therefore, your greed must be matched with your service. There is no one set price for a good or for production. Raw goods in your backyard could be much less efficient to extract than to trade with somebody far away, with much less of that resource because of technologies and efficient modes of transport. High prices show scarcity and demand, signaling an opportunity to profit while reducing its scarcity. Central planning requires enforcement to keep all things within the system in check to function properly, maintaining discipline, surveillance, coercion, and punishment. What you do or don't do becomes a theft or disservice from the whole. In the South, labor was plentiful and wages were low. Many who commented on Southern labor noted how many people it could take to equal one laborer of the North. Many cited between 2 and 4. Frederick Douglass noted on his accounts of the North that the average laborer had finer furnishings than the slave master in the South. 9 out of 10 plantations were in debt at the time of the Civil War. Farms were not profitable. Many Northerners noted how slavery didn't make any economic sense. An average male costing $1,500 or more plus decades of care when the daily wage was 25 cents for unskilled labor meant that it could take 20 years or more to reach profitability. The reason it was done was not for economic efficiency. It was because the plantations were completely dependent on labor during crucial times of planting and harvesting. Without the labor on hand and ready when needed could mean the prices during that time could be exuberant as well as hard to find, and possibly jeopardizing having a harvest at all. During the winter there was very little work, and the cost of labor would plummet. These uncertainties and massive price fluctuations were part of the chaos they thought they were solving from free labor, without recognizing their system made it worse for free labor absent of innovation. Cheap labor took the necessity out of mechanization, keeping them technologically backwards as compared with the North. Slavery itself was dying due to the lack of profitability, tropical competition for sugar and rice, and as more places grew and sold, tobacco, and cotton until Eli Whitney's cotton gin in 1793, giving the southern planters an advantage, making cotton profitable for them until that invention became commonplace among other countries, diminishing the value of cotton and therefore the profitability of slavery itself. The high cost and labor involved in producing food, along with the inefficiency of slave labor and unmotivated efforts, made slavery a costly endeavor with a high buy in price. The Civil War was the war of the parties, Republican versus Democrat, both with two different economic systems, one being a centrally controlled, collectively stratified social system, the other based off of freedom of trade and individualism. So, no, slavery is not capitalism. In fact, free market capitalism and the principles behind it freed the slaves and destroyed the aristocratic socialist system in which it was, not Marxist in theory but communist in practice, aristocratic in social order and paternalistic in socialist theory. Working within a capitalist system they were tied to, but worked to distance themselves from in theory and practice.